A friend of mine found this manuscript next to a corpse in the Parisian catacombs. Written by Phoenix Flies, narrated by Frankie Denham. A friend of mine is an urban explorer. He goes to some weird ass places. He's done Chernobyl, toured abandoned shopping centres and theme parks across the world. Technically, he's committing crimes a lot of the time, although he sees them as victimless. He's only putting himself at risk by going to these places. So to play it safe, he wants to stay anonymous for this. One of his favourite haunts is the maze of tunnels beneath the city of Paris. He says they're monitored by police or security guards or something like that, but that there's only 4 or 5 of them at most down there at any given time. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of miles of tunnels, so he likes to pretend he's in some sort of Assassin's Creed style game and stalk the guards without them noticing. I try not to judge. I mean, people are gonna get their kicks wherever. But last week, he found something. He was apparently in one of the more roughly quarried sections of the catacombs, chased out of familiar territory by a guard who caught sight of him when he saw this. I've been given a scan of the manuscript, and to the best of my ability, I've copied it up here. It's a bit heavy going in places. As for when it was written, your guess is as good as mine. I just hope this is some sort of elaborate hoax. Otherwise, well, fuck. Anyway, here it is. Forgive the haste of these passages, for I must work diligently to make my final act the inscription of the events of this past few hours, and what little I understand of the discoveries preceding them before my remaining light gives out, and I am lost to the annals of time. If any civilization remains to read this, please forgive the part I played in unleashing whatever chaos is presently upon the world. My name is Dr. Harold Flint, and with my associate, Dr. Adrian Cole, I ventured into these catacombs with purely the most benevolent of archaeological intentions. I was Cole's apprentice while I studied beneath him for my postgraduate qualification, in awe of the man's insight and intellect since first we crossed paths some 20 years hence. When I graduated and took up my present position at Oxford, the two of us remained in close communication and academic collaboration. Several years ago, Dr. Cole made some rather audacious claims at a conference, marrying our chosen field of archaeology with theoretical physics and ancient philosophy, with the gathered minds shooting him down quite severely. Undeterred, or most likely spurred on by their disapproval, he spurned human connections entirely until 2 months ago, suddenly emerging from his self-imposed exile and publishing a paper entitled The Potem Tau, or Mankind's Echo Through Time. Widely regarded as the ravings of a genius tipped over the borderline to insanity, it was more his Mona Lisa, his personal Sistine Chapel. Dr. Cole had publicly stood by what he wrote. His university had dismissed him. I had publicly dismissed what he wrote. My university stood by me. Nevertheless, he re-established discursive contact with me, and I, for my part, was more receptive than most. From what I could decipher of his fairly incomprehensible speech, he had been trawling through historical documents to track down the movement of a specific artifact, a relic believed to be the source of as a wide variety of powers and phenomena as there are cultures who claimed at a point in time to be in the possession of it. Dr. Cole quoted such a plethora of scriptures, it seemed apt to compare its legacy to that of the Holy Grail, whereof most accounts are fiction, fancy, and falsehood, distilled from the rarest grain of genuine truth. It was this grain that Dr. Cole claimed to have tracked down, having chased it through academia from the sands of Arabia to the Tibetan plateaus, and it is to this very spot he traced its journey, supposedly predating even the Babylonians and Sumerians. This particular relic had found its way to Europe through the common medieval practice of trading and thieving such articles, before being sealed off in the chamber adjacent to where this note will have been discovered, surrounded here by the bones of countless Parisians. I can hardly think of a more appropriate resting place. Indeed, here it should well have remained, untouched and silent in its vigil, as I undoubtedly will. We had arrived here some 3 days previous, after a challenging and disorientating journey through the murky depths of these catacombs. Preparing for what we thought was the worst case scenario, we had packed enough water and canned food to last us for 2 days, with enough torchlight to see me through, hopefully, until this account has been penned. We carried with us 2 radio communicators, one of which has been sat unresponsive by my side for the greater part of 24 hours. To my acute despair, I cannot account for the present whereabouts of Dr. Cole. All I know, and what little I understand of precisely what occurred following the chamber's discovery, will follow. The door itself, as you may observe, appears to be a rectangular construction of chiselled quartz, gleaming with a once polished lustre at odds with the dull stone surrounding it, and barely larger than the frame of an average man. There was no obvious mechanism for its release, and Dr. Cole shared with me little of the strategy he employed in its opening. Yet open it nevertheless he did. He had laid his hands on either side of the block, roughly equidistant from its centre, and uttered something in a dialect I did not recognise, but which my untrained ear would approximately transcribe as "O Shah Potmata." Aside from the nomenclature of the artifact itself, I can neither claim to understand the phrase nor its implication, but upon the utterance a deep rumble began behind the door. A century or so of dust and grime, shaken free into a coarse choking cloud in its manipulation by unseen mechanisms. As we both retreated in simultaneous spasmodic fits of coughing, the quartz entrance slid upward, revealing a precisely carved bare passage, the darkness within seemingly thicker and heavier than that which surrounded us. Any explorer without our zest and zeal would have likely been perturbed, or at least discouraged from the idea of entering the narrow hallway extending before us beyond the reach of our torchlight. Something about its geometry seemed at odds with itself. It may have been a trick of the dim light, but the walls seemed at once impossibly straight and gradually twisted, as if a steady spiral began at the entrance and continued to some indistinguishable depth. At the same time, however, there was a deliberate precision in their carving, and I regret being sufficiently qualified in neither mathematics nor engineering to discern any meaning or purpose behind our observations. In hindsight, we should have retreated and returned with a varied team of academics at a later point to conduct a thorough analysis. With such hindsight, however, we never should have opened the door in the first place. Nevertheless, Dr. Cole and I had already discussed our procedure should the entrance be uncovered, so that we would not act in panic or be overwhelmed by the range of feelings and emotions that even now still roll within my bowel. I am struck by a profound sense of awe that, in spite of my lack of comprehension, shook my rudimentary understanding of the world and made me question all which I had previously held clear and true. More distressing, though, is the veil of dread that clings to my sweet, slick skin and dwells deep and heavy within my core. We had entered, then taking with him a torch and one of our 2 radios, leaving me at the ingress. I watched in equal excitement and apprehension as his silhouette against the torchlight faded into the distant darkness, leaving the orange glow to dim and die behind him. We carried with each of us a pocket watch, and I was to check on him at intervals of exactly 60 seconds. This I did, and his regular responses reassured me that he was making good progress along the tunnel. I could not yet see any form of chamber or opening. We discussed the subtle illusion of the spiral, which still seemed as prevalent as he continued through the passageway. A full 15 minutes had passed by, and we had moved to discuss the futility of our exercise. Our radios were presumably reaching the end of their receptive distance, with a harsh crackling interference distorting our voices, and I had only just suggested making my way along the chiselled corridor behind him when he let out a cry of what I believed to be distress, but soon discovered to be elation. His torchlight had caught the end of the passage, and he was excitedly making his way into the chamber that awaited. I hesitated, unable to make out what he was saying over the static, before informing him that, contrary to our agreed procedure, I was following. Over my shoulder, I could still make out the rectangular entrance where Dr. Cole's voice filtered back into the relative clarity over the radio, and I halted my advance. He had been describing the room he found himself in with an unrestrained and unabashed excitement, gushing gleefully about a floor of concentric circles, pillars upon pillars, and intricate timeless carvings of the language of which he had spoken earlier. It was a marvellous sight. He explained the scale of the place, thus that he could not make out the surrounding walls of the sheer number of gargantuan ceiling supports. The centrepiece of it all, he related, was a lustrous altar, possibly a sarcophagus, carved from some blue mineral that particularly reflected the light of his torch in dazzling effects. It was as he approached the azure altar that he ceased responding to my request for contact. I was anxiously glancing from the face of my timepiece to the oppressive darkness of the tunnel before me and back again, my heart thudding to be free of my chest with every passing minute. I rationalized that perhaps in his advancement through such a massive chamber, he may have moved further out of range of the radio. Steeling myself, I set off once again after my colleague. I had called out 4 of my minute-by-minute alerts before I heard his voice again, still broken by the persistent interference, but undoubtedly tinged with panic. "Come no further," he was insisting, over and over. "Come no further. Turn back." Having advanced thus far into the tunnel, I did not heed his warnings, picking up my pace to try and clear the signal, pressing him for a reason, an explanation, asking him for what in God's name was happening. In spite of my concern, he neglected to answer. Redoubling his pleas for my retreat, "Return to the entrance," he yelled, his voice strained through anguished sobs. "Place your hands on either side of this door and seal this away." The utterance stopped me in my tracks, the honest insistency of his voice chilling me. I had still been rushing to his aid. He was clearly in the need of assistance, and I was the only one poised to assist. Yet in practical terms, if we would certainly both be in danger, It was not worth the entire expedition meeting our fate down here, with no warning left to any would-be explorers, with no indication of our whereabouts for the discovery and interment our bodies. I prefer to think of this moment pragmatically, for the greater good, but it was more like an unforgivable compound of cowardice and terror that invoked my steady backward retreat. I was still calling out for Dr. Cole as the radios flickered in and out of signal, still begging to know why, pleading with him to tell me what he saw. I still hoped to see the glow of his torch following me back along the passage, still prayed for his safekeeping. The sound emanating from my radio in response was not reassuring in the least. The occasional sharp breath, a grunt of effort, a cry of alarm. His final words to me came through in a moment of surprising clarity, as if he had been by my side the entire time. Yet they will stay weighing my conscience down until my dying breath, confounding and terrifying me even beyond. "They're still here," he had said. "Harold, they've been here all along. They're coming." That was all I needed to turn tail and break out into as close as the narrow passage would permit to a sprint for the entrance. As my torchlight flashed unsteadily around me, I am truly ashamed and emasculated to admit that I stumbled, the wall stealing the skin from my elbow on my brief journey to the floor of the corridor, the darkness enveloping me in my relieving embrace of unconsciousness. I awoke in the shallow puddle of crimson, a deep gash on my forehead still leaking the liquid. Bleary and unsteady, I clambered to my feet and exited the passageway, slumping to the ground and questioning whether what had transpired was reality or the nightmarish product of concussion. I needed to write this down to make sure, to check for the sake of my sanity whether I feel I am drawing more from the fact or fancy. In transcribing this, I am increasingly sure of the tangibility of what transpired. In gazing around at the musty catacombs, I feel ever more fearfully rooted in the real. Dr. Cole has been lost, somewhere within that dreaded tunnel. 2 hours had passed between the discovery of the chamber and my revival, so it was entirely plausible to me that he had made good his escape, passing my prone form and leaving me for dead. Yet as the entrance was unsealed, the implication was more dire than I dared accept. I waited by the open door, calling out on the radio 100 times or more, tears mixing with the blood that still rolled down my cheek, as I felt I may be giving in to the mania, to mirage. I saw a dim glow from deep within the tunnel, growing gradually in intensity. My hopes surged, my logic overwhelmed by optimism. I should have known that should Dr. Cole be making his way back to me with his torch in hand, the light would have been yellow. I may not have been thinking straight when I assumed my colleague's radio had been broken, but that he was here now, pressing forth out of the passage, accompanied by a soft blue light. I was freely weeping with joy at this sight, on my hands and knees in the entryway, screaming his name with the enthusiasm of an asylum committal. There was a figure there, I was sure of it, making his way along the corridor, growing nearer and nearer, silent but clearly drawn by my shouts. In a moment of startling lucidity, something slotted into place in my mind, or rather fell out of place. I stood in an instant, my hands on either side of the door, All my optimism drained from me as I prayed that this was all that was sealing off the chamber, as Dr. Cole had implied. Sure enough, that reassuring grind of stone against stone sounded, the massive block of quartz sliding back into place. The blue glow I was being bathed with being cut off to a band across my legs and then gone. The catacombs were silent around me, save for the furious panting of my breath, the air dripping with an atmosphere heavy enough to bury me alive. It slowly sunk in that I had sealed my companion, my friend, my mentor inside this place of marvel and discovery, turning into his tomb. We had failed on our quest, a quest for something I did not fully understand, and the only man who did understand our pursuit and its objective were entombed within it. I dreaded making my way back to the surface, explaining this to the police, to Dr. Cole's albeit estranged family. No matter which way I twisted it in my head, I was responsible for his fate. I had plenty of opportunity to rush to his aid, and I left him to die. I had killed him. There was no denying my culpability. It was only as I was cradling my bruised and battered ego that I reminisced on the instance of my fall. It was utterly inexcusable, utterly unforgivable, since I had more than enough light to see by. Not just the torchlight, which I kept steady in front of me, but the faint blue glow illuminating my panic-stricken footsteps. The wind of realization blew me away. I was not alone in my retreat. Something had caught up with me. Something had pushed me. Had made its way past me. Something had escaped. Something that had lain inside that chamber for centuries, perhaps longer. Something of unspeakable power and influence. Something untainted by the passing aeons. As my torch dies, I must describe the observation that instilled the panic I experienced directly before sealing away what I thought was the only inhabitant of this sacred tomb. Why I would most likely be deemed a sufferer of some concussion-induced dementia. The figure, bathed in blue light, was certainly humanoid at least, even if its limbs were disproportionate in their elongation. But the geometry of the corridor itself has suddenly made a bizarre sort of sense to me when I realized, in profound horror, that the figure was inverted. It walked smoothly and purposefully towards me, its head a few inches off the floor, its feet progressing steadily along the ceiling of the passage. I cannot bring this tale to the surface world. I can only sit, cling to the futile hope that someone discovers me, and by proxy, this note. Until then, I shall remain here, praying that the hammering and pleading I can still hear behind the quartz is not that of my colleague, but another mere illusion of my exhausted mind. I shall rest here a while and attempt to ignore the screams. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please leave a comment, like the video, or even subscribe to the channel for future content.